September 1943, 6,000 feet over the Huon Gulf. A lone P-38 Lightning banks hard into a thunderhead, while 6 Japanese Zeros close from behind. The pilot is 22 years old. His squadron mates called him naive. His commanding officer wrote him up twice for ignoring Doctrine. Now he's attempting a maneuver that shouldn't exist. A turn so tight, so impossible for a twin-engine fighter, that enemy pilots will mistake it for mechanical failure. They won't realize their mistake until it's too late. New Guinea in 1943 is not a front line. It's a fever dream wrapped in jungle and rain. The smell of aviation fuel mixes with rotten vegetation. Mosquitoes swarm thick enough to obscure instrument panels. Pilots sleep in tents that flood during monsoons, wake to briefings held under tarps, and fly missions over an island that has already killed more men from disease than combat. The 5th Air Force operates from crude airstrips hacked out of kunai grass, Marston matting laid over mud. Ground crews work barefoot because boots rot through in days. Mechanics strip parts from wrecked aircraft because supply chains move slower than the war. Every mission is a gamble against weather, distance, and an enemy who knows the terrain better than any map. Japanese fighters rule the northern approaches. Zeros and Oscars, flown by veterans of China and the Philippines, men who learned combat when most American pilots were still in high school. They're lighter, more agile, capable of turning inside anything the Allies can field. American doctrine is clear. Never dogfight a Zero. Use speed and altitude. Boom and zoom. Dive, fire, climb away. Repeat. It's sound advice. Logical, built on physics and survival statistics. And for most pilots it works. But Doctrine assumes every aircraft behaves as designed. It assumes pilots follow the manual. It doesn't account for farm boys who grew up coaxing more out of machinery than engineers ever intended. The P-38 Lightning is a paradox. Twin engine, twin boom, heavy and fast. It can outrun almost anything at altitude and deliver devastating firepower from its nose-mounted guns. But it's not a dogfighter. The manual says so. Training officers say so. Combat veterans say so. It turns like a freight train, bleeds energy in hard banks, and if you try to muscle it into a tight turn at low speed, it'll snap into a spin that kills you before you can recover. So, the doctrine is simple. Stay fast. Stay high. Use your range and your guns. Don't try to turn with the enemy. It's good advice. Almost everyone follows it. Almost. If this history matters to you, tap like and subscribe. His name was Richard Ira Bong. Born December 24, 1920 in Superior, Wisconsin. Third of 9 children. His father was a Swedish immigrant who worked the land and fixed farm equipment with wire and intuition. His mother taught school. The family lived on a stretch of flat country where winter came early and left late, where machinery either worked or you made it work, because no one was coming to help. Bong grew up elbow-deep in tractor engines. He learned early that manuals were guidelines, not gospels. A machine had tendencies, not limitations. You learned its moods, its balance points, the edge where performance lived just before failure. He flew his first airplane at 18, a friend's light trainer, and felt immediately that the same logic applied. Weight, thrust, pressure, timing. It was just another machine, and every machine could give you more if you understood it deeply enough. He enlisted in May 1941, before the war began for America, but after it was clear where the world was heading. Flight training at places with names like Thunderbird Field and Luke. He was quiet, polite, and average in most respects. Instructors noted good reflexes and adequate gunnery. Nothing exceptional, no red flags. He graduated and received his wings in January 1942, 1 month after Pearl Harbor. Then the trouble started. Not from defiance or arrogance, from curiosity. He flew low over a friend's house in California and got written up. He barrel-rolled over the Golden Gate Bridge and earned a reprimand. His superiors labeled him reckless. He didn't see it that way. He was testing limits, learning what the aircraft would tolerate and where the margin really was. Every stunt taught him something the manual didn't mention: how the P-38 felt on the edge of a stall, how much rudder it took to snap the nose around, how the props torqued differently, depending on throttle and angle. It wasn't showboating, it was research. But the Army Air Forces didn't see it that way. They sent him to the Pacific in September 1942, assigned to the 49th Fighter Group, New Guinea, the place where young pilots went to learn or die. His squadron mates were older, harder, veteran pilots who'd survived the Philippines retreat and Java. They viewed Bong with polite skepticism. A kid from Wisconsin who'd buzzed bridges and hadn't seen combat. They called him Farm Boy, sometimes to his face. It wasn't cruel, just descriptive. He didn't talk much, didn't gamble or drink heavily, spent his downtime writing letters home or walking the airstrip perimeter, watching mechanics work. He was likable, but no one expected much. His first kills came in December 1942. 2 zeros during a bomber escort mission, clean, by-the-book engagements, boom and zoom. The squadron congratulated him. Standard work. Then in January, during a low-level sweep, something shifted. A 0 got on his tail during a strafing run. Bong should have used power, extended, escaped. Instead, he pulled into a climbing turn, tighter than the manual recommended, tighter than training allowed. The P-38 shuddered, buffeted on the edge of a stall. The 0 followed, confident. Then Bong rolled out, snap-turned using rudder and differential throttle, and the 0 flashed past his nose. 3 seconds of gunfire. The enemy fighter disintegrated. It was instinct, or intuition, or farm boy logic applied at 4,000 feet. His wingman reported it as luck. Bong said nothing, but he filed the maneuver away. It had worked. That meant it was repeatable. By mid-1943, the air war over New Guinea had become a mathematics problem no one could solve. American bombers needed fighter escort to survive. Japanese interceptors needed to break through the escorts to kill the bombers. Both sides knew the equation. The side with better fighters, better tactics, or better luck would win. The 0 remained the variable that tilted everything. Mitsubishi's A6M was a masterpiece of minimalist design, light, maneuverable, flown by pilots trained in brutal, unforgiving schools. In a turning fight, a 0 could outcircle anything America fielded: P-40s, P-39s, even the new P-38s. Physics didn't lie. A lighter aircraft with lower wing loading could turn tighter. Period. So American doctrine became rigid: never dogfight. Use altitude, speed, teamwork, dive on the enemy, fire, climb back to safety, rinse and repeat. It worked, mostly, but it meant conceding the vertical fight, conceding slow-speed maneuverability, conceding any scenario where you couldn't dictate terms. It meant flying scared. And it meant that any time bombers got jumped at low altitude, or escorts were separated, or weather forced everyone down into the weeds, American pilots died. Commanders knew it. Intelligence knew it. Everyone knew it. The solution wasn't mystery. Build a lighter fighter or train pilots longer or overwhelm the enemy with numbers, but lighter fighters were years away. Pilot training took time the war wouldn't give, and numbers didn't help much when 6 zeros could tie up 20 P-38s just by forcing them into defensive turns. Meanwhile, pilots kept dying. Not dramatically, just steadily. A fighter lost here, 2 there. Parachutes over jungle where rescue never came. Empty cots in tents. Letters home written by squadron mates. The losses were sustainable statistically. The Air Forces could replace pilots faster than they fell. But sustainability isn't victory, and the men doing the dying knew the difference. Bong was among them, flying mission after mission through that summer. By August, he had 12 confirmed kills, enough to make ace twice over, enough to earn respect. But respect didn't change doctrine, and doctrine still said the P-38 couldn't dogfight. He didn't argue, didn't write reports or challenge briefings, but he kept testing. On every mission, in every engagement, he pushed a little further into the margins. Tighter turns, slower speeds, steeper climbs. He learned that the P-38 had a quirk, a narrow band of speed and power where it could do things it wasn't supposed to. If you kept the throttles uneven, used rudder aggressively, and rode the edge of stall buffet without crossing it, the big twin-engine fighter could snap around nearly as fast as a single-engine plane. Not quite as tight as a Zero, but close enough that geometry started to matter more than turn radius. He didn't tell anyone. There was nothing to tell yet, just a theory, a feeling. The kind of knowledge you carry in your hands and spine, not your head. He needed proof, and proof required the right circumstances. The kind of circumstances that Doctrine said you should avoid at all costs. September 12, 1943. Morning mission briefing in a tent that smelt like mildew and cigarette smoke. The target was a Japanese airfield near Wewak. Bombers would hit the runway and revetments. Fighters would escort and sweep. Standard operation. Expect heavy resistance. Zeros and Oscars based nearby. Fly smart. Fly fast. Don't get separated. Bong sat near the back, barely listening. He'd flown this profile 24 times. The variables never changed much. Altitude, heading, fuel load, radio frequencies. The rest you figured out when it happened. Takeoff at 0800, 16 P-38s forming up over the coast, climbing through haze toward the bombers. The weather was typical. Broken clouds, scattered rain, visibility shifting minute to minute. The kind of sky where you could lose a wingman just by glancing away. They made contact with the bombers over the Gulf. B-25s, low and heavy, their formations tight. The fighters spread into escort positions. High cover, low cover, flankers. Bong flew mid-level, scanning the horizon. The coastline approached. Green jungle, white beaches, the glint of rivers winding inland. Beautiful and deadly. Somewhere below, spotters were already radioing ahead. The Zeros came up fast, climbing out of low clouds like sharks rising from depth. 15, maybe 20. They ignored the bombers initially and went straight for the fighters. Classic tactics. Break the escort, then feast on the bombers. The radio erupted. Calls of contacts, headings, altitudes. The neat formations dissolved into chaos. Bong rolled toward the nearest fight. 2 Zeros chasing a P-38 in a shallow dive. He dropped in behind, lined up the trailing Zero, fired. Pieces flew off the wing root. The Zero snap-rolled and dove away trailing smoke. Bong didn't follow, already scanning for the next threat. That's when he saw them. 6 Zeros, slightly below, turning toward a pair of P-38s that had drifted south. The Americans hadn't seen them yet. Bong pushed the throttles forward and dove. His wingman called something over the radio. Bong didn't respond. No time. He closed to 1,000 yards. The Zeros spotted him and broke. 4 went defensive, turning hard to meet him head-on. 2 continued after the P-38s. Bong fired at the nearest Zero, but missed. The Japanese pilots were good. They split vertically, 2 climbing, 2 diving, forcing Bong to choose. He pulled up after the climbers. His airspeed dropped. The P-38 felt heavy, mushy. He fired again. No hits. The Zeros rolled over the top and came back down at him from opposite sides. This was where Doctrine said to dive away. Use speed. Reset. But the 2 P-38s were still in danger below, and the 4 Zeros were already repositioning. If Bong ran, 6 enemy fighters would regroup, and someone would die. So he did the thing the manual forbade. He pulled into a max performance turn. Not a gentle bank. A hard, wrenching haul on the yoke, full rudder, throttles staggered, nose high. The airframe groaned. The stall, warning, buffeted the controls. The P-38 seemed to pivot on its center of gravity, swapping energy for angle, bleeding speed for geometry. The first Zero shot past, too committed to adjust. The second tried to tighten his turn. Bong snap rolled, reversed, and pulled again. The world spun. Sky, clouds, jungle, sea. His vision tunneled. The G-force pressed him into the seat. He eased off just enough to stay conscious, then pulled again, and suddenly he was inside their turn. Not behind, but inside. The Zeros had followed him into the spiral, confident in their advantage, but Bong had turned tighter than physics said a P-38 could turn. He'd sacrificed speed, altitude, safety margin. He'd flown right to the edge of a stall and held it there. And now 6 Japanese fighters were locked in a rotating fight with nowhere to go but through his guns. The first Zero never saw it coming. Bong rolled level just long enough to put the gun sight on target. The P-38's nose-mounted weapons, 4 50 caliber machine guns and 1 20mm cannon, fired as a single massed volley. No convergence issues, no wing-mounted spread, just a concentrated stream of destruction. The Zero's canopy shattered. Fire bloomed from the engine. The fighter rolled inverted and fell away. The other 5 tried to scatter, but they were too slow, too close, trapped by their own commitment to the turn. Bong adjusted rudder, pushed throttle, pulled again. The P-38 responded like a machine possessed. Shuddering, groaning, but turning, staying inside the radius, denying geometry. The second Zero climbed, trying to gain separation. Bong pulled lead, fired, walked the tracers into the fuselage. The tail section came apart. The Zero spun into clouds. Now the remaining 4 understood. They broke in different directions. 2 rolled out and dove for speed. Bong let them go. The other 2 tried to reverse back into him, a desperate countermaneuver. Textbook aggression. But Bong had already anticipated. He snap-rolled using differential throttle, left engine high, right engine low, and the P-38 rotated faster than any twin-engine fighter should. He came out nose-on to the third Zero at 300 yards. Both pilots fired. Tracers crossed mid-air. Bong's rounds hit first. The Zero's propeller exploded into shrapnel. The fighter nosed over and dropped. The fourth Zero pilot broke hard left, then right, then rolled into a split S toward the jungle. A good escape. Bong followed, easing the P-38 into the dive. The airspeed built. 300 knots. 350. The controls stiffened. He fired a long burst, more suppression than aimed. The Zero jinked, hit treetops, and cartwheeled into green. 4 down, 2 running. Bong pulled out of the dive at 2,000 feet. His arms ached. Sweat soaked his flight suit. The engine tanks were redlined. The airframe had stress-wrinkled panels, but the P-38 was still flying. He keyed the radio and called clear. His wingman responded, disbelief edging his voice. He'd watched the whole thing. He didn't understand what he'd seen. Neither did the 2 P-38 pilots Bong had saved. They rejoined him on the way back to base, waggling wings in thanks. Bong just nodded, though they couldn't see him. He ran through the fight mentally, cataloging what worked, and what almost didn't. The turn had been tighter than before. Maybe too tight. He'd felt the airframe flex. Felt the edge of departure. A few knots slower and he'd have spun. A little more G and he'd have blacked out. But it had worked. The flight back was uneventful. The bombers had hit their targets. A few more fights had broken out, scattered and inconclusive. By the time the formation crossed back over the Gulf, the sky was empty and the weather was closing in again. They landed in rain, the P-38s aquaplaning on the steel mat. Ground, crews rushing out to chalk wheels and inspect damage. Bong's aircraft was battered, stress cracks in the wing roots, oil streaking from one engine, panel fasteners sheared. The crew chief walked around it twice, sallied, then looked up at Bong, climbing down from the cockpit. He asked what happened. Bong said he turned hard. The crew chief said no kidding and made a note to pull the wings for inspection. Debriefing was held in the operations tent. Bong reported 4 confirmed kills, maybe 5. The intelligence officer asked for details. Bong described the engagement in flat, factual terms: altitude, heading, sequence of events. He didn't mention the turn, didn't describe the technique, just said he maneuvered and fired. The officer wrote it down. Another successful mission. Another few zeros that wouldn't threaten bombers again. But Bong's wingman told a different story. He described the turning fight, the impossible spiral, the way Bong had outmaneuvered 6 enemy fighters in a plane that wasn't supposed to dogfight. Other pilots listened skeptical. A P-38 couldn't turn like that. Everyone knew it. The wingman insisted he'd seen it, watched the whole thing. The squadron commander asked Bong directly, was it true? Had he really outturned Zeros in a Lightning? Bong hesitated, then he said yes. The commander frowned. He asked how. Bong tried to explain. Throttle management, rudder coordination, flying on the edge of stall. The words came out clumsy. It wasn't something you could convey in a briefing tent. It was something you felt through the stick and rudder pedals, learned across hours of testing, refined through instinct. The commander didn't understand. He told Bong to be careful, told him not to get cocky, told him that Doctrine existed for good reasons, and breaking it got pilots killed. Bong said yes, sir, and left the tent. He didn't argue. There was no point. They'd believe him or they wouldn't. The only proof was survival, and the only test was the next mission. 2 days later, every P-38 pilot in the squadron wanted to know how Bong had done it. Not officially. No formal request went up the chain. But in the tents at night, during pre-flight checks, in the mess line, pilots asked. Bong tried to explain. He demonstrated with his hands, miming throttle and stick movements. Some pilots nodded and said they'd try it. Others shook their heads and said it sounded like suicide. Within a week, 3 other pilots reported successfully using the technique in combat. Tighter turns than they'd thought possible. Defensive maneuvers that broke enemy attacks. One pilot used it to reverse a pursuit and scored a kill. Another used it to evade 2 Zeros and escape. None of them pushed it as far as Bong had. But the principle was proven. The P-38 could dogfight, not easily, not safely, but possible. Word spread. Other squadrons heard about it. Pilots compared notes. Maintenance crews noticed the increased stress on airframes, the cracked panels, and strained fittings. They reinforced where they could and warned pilots about limits. The technique had a price. Every hard turn aged the aircraft. Every buffet and shutter wore metal. But in exchange, pilots gained an option they hadn't had before. A way to survive when speed and altitude weren't available. A way to fight back. By November, tactical briefings began to change. Not the official doctrine. That stayed the same. But the informal guidance, the advice passed from flight leaders to new pilots. They still said, avoid turning fights when possible. Still said use speed and altitude. But now they added a caveat. If you have no choice, if you're slow and low and the enemy is on you, the Lightning can turn harder than you think. Here's how. Bong flew 20 more missions that fall. His kill count climbed. 15, 20, 25. By December, he was the top-scoring American ace in the Pacific. Reporters wrote about him. Newsreels featured him. The farm boy from Wisconsin who shot down Zeros like clay pigeons. The stories didn't mention the technique, didn't explain the turns or the throttle work. They focused on the score, the tally, the simple narrative of American ingenuity beating Japanese aggression. But the pilots knew. The mechanics knew. The men who flew and fought and survived because of what Bong had figured out. They didn't call him Farm Boy anymore. They called him Dick, or Major Bong after his promotion. Some just called him the best. He stayed humble, wrote letters home to his parents and his girlfriend Marged, talked about the weather and the food and how much he missed Wisconsin. Didn't talk much about combat. In photos from that time, he looks young and tired. Thin face, dark eyes, a half smile that doesn't quite reach all the way. The look of someone who's seen too much, but hasn't figured out how to carry it yet. The ripple didn't stop at New Guinea. Pilots rotated back to the States for leave or training assignments. They brought the technique with them, told other pilots, demonstrated in practice flights. Flight instructors tested it and added it to advanced training curriculum, not as official doctrine, but as field-tested reality. The P-38's reputation began to shift. It was still a boom and zoom fighter, still best used with speed and altitude. But now it had depth, flexibility, a backup option when the mission went sideways. Combat loss rates for P-38 squadrons dropped measurably in early 1944. Not dramatically. The air war was still brutal and unforgiving. But the margins shifted. Pilots survived encounters they wouldn't have before, came home when they should have died. The statistics were bloodless, a few percentage points. But behind every percentage point was a man who walked away, a letter that didn't have to be written, a family that stayed whole. No one attributed it directly to Bong's technique. War is too chaotic for clean causality. A dozen factors influenced survival: training, experience, teamwork, luck. But the technique was part of the mix. One more tool in the kit. One more reason to believe the Lightning could hold its own. The war ended and Bong came home. 40 kills. The highest-scoring American ace of World War II. Medals, parades, headlines. He married Marge in February 1945. They moved to California, where he took a job as a test pilot for Lockheed. He flew the new jets, the P-80 Shooting Stars, sleek and fast and temperamental, the future of aviation. On August 6, 1945, the same day the Enola Gay dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Bong took off on a routine test flight. The P-80's engine failed on takeoff. He tried to recover, couldn't, ejected too late. The parachute didn't deploy. He died on impact. He was 24 years old. The nation mourned. President Truman sent condolences. Newspapers ran obituaries. The Air Force named a base after him in Wisconsin. But among the pilots who'd flown with him, who'd learned from him, who'd survived because of what he'd figured out, the grief was personal and quiet. They'd lost the man who showed them that limits were negotiable. Decades later, aviation historians studied his combat reports. They analyzed his kills, his tactics, the way he'd bent a heavy fighter into geometries it wasn't designed for. Some called it genius. Others called it instinct. A few called it luck. They were all right and all wrong. What Bong did wasn't one thing. It was the accumulation of 1,000 small observations, a farm boy's intuition about machines, and the courage to test theory against reality when reality could kill you. The P-38 remained in service through the end of the war. It flew reconnaissance missions over Europe, ground attack runs in the Pacific, and long-range escorts that no other fighter could match. Pilots continued to use the technique Bong pioneered, refining it, teaching it, passing it down. The Lightning's reputation solidified. Not the best dogfighter, not the fastest or most agile, but versatile, survivable, capable of more than the manual promised. When the war ended, most P-38s were scrapped or sold. A few ended up in museums. Visitors walk past them now, read the placards, admire the twin booms and the nose-mounted guns. The placards mention speed and range and firepower. They mention Bong's 40 kills. They don't mention the turn, don't explain the throttle work or the rudder coordination. Don't describe the moment when a farm boy from Wisconsin looked at a problem everyone else accepted and decided to solve it anyway. But the lesson remains. Embedded in the airframe, in the combat reports, in the survival statistics that shifted just enough to matter. The lesson that expertise isn't always found in manuals, that courage sometimes looks like curiosity, that the space between what a machine is designed to do and what it can actually do is where survival lives. Bong never wrote a memoir. never gave interviews explaining his technique in detail. He didn't think of himself as an innovator, just a pilot doing his job, trying to come home, helping others do the same. The farm boy logic that made him extraordinary was the same logic that made him humble. You don't brag about fixing a tractor, you just fix it. His legacy isn't the kills or the medals or the records. It's the knowledge that limits are often softer than we think, that institutions can be wrong, that a young man with grease under his fingernails and an open mind can see what experts miss, that logic and courage together can bend the trajectory of history, one impossible turn at a time. Somewhere over the Pacific, in the space where sea meets sky, the memory of that September morning still hangs. 6 zeros closing in. A P-38 pulling harder than physics should allow. A moment when everything that shouldn't work did. And a farm boy from Wisconsin proving that the only real limits are the ones we accept without question.